In the blood-stained grasslands of Montana Territory, 1868, a lone figure knelt among the carnage. The setting sun cast long shadows across the remains of what had once been a 16-wagon caravan bound for the gold fields of Helena. Now, only splintered wood, scattered belongings, and the bodies of 37 settlers marked its final resting place in the valley locals called Whispering Grass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The kneeling man, Akecheta, scout for the 7th Cavalry, surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. His weathered face betrayed no emotion as he studied the tracks surrounding the massacre site. This wasn't the work of Crow warriors, as the army would surely claim. The hoof prints, the bullet casings, the pattern of attack, all pointed to white men, rustlers or outlaws playing a dangerous game, leaving signs to implicate the Apsayaluki people. A soft sound, barely perceptible against the prairie wind, caught his attention. Akecheta rose silently, hand moving to the knife at his belt. Again the sound came, a muffled whimper from beneath an overturned wagon, half consumed by fire. Approaching with caution, he peered into the blackened cavity created by the wagon's sidewall and the ground. 2 eyes stared back at him from the darkness. Not a child's, as he might have expected, but the cloudy blue eyes of an elderly woman. "I won't hurt you," he said in English, extending his hand. "The attackers are gone." The woman didn't move, clutching something to her chest, a family Bible, its leather cover stained dark with what Akecheta knew was blood. "They killed my son," she whispered, her voice cracking with age and grief. "My daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, all of them, gone." As Akecheta helped the woman from her hiding place, he noted her age, perhaps 70 summers, remarkable for any settler, let alone one braving the dangerous journey west. Her grey hair had come loose from its pins, and her dress, once a practical brown cotton, was now torn and smudged with soot and earth. Yet despite her fragile appearance, there was a steel in her gaze that spoke of a lifetime of hardships overcome. "I'm Margaret Blackwood," she said, drawing herself up with dignity despite her trembling limbs. "And you are?" "Akecheta, scout for Fort Ellis." Margaret surveyed the devastation around them, her eyes lingering on a body lying some 20 paces away. A young man whose outstretched hand seemed to reach for the overturned wagon where she had hidden. "My son," she explained, following Akecheta's gaze. "Thomas tried to reach me when the shooting started." Her voice remained steady, though her hands gripped the Bible tighter. "Will you help me bury them, sir? I cannot leave them to the wolves." Akecheta considered the woman carefully. The cavalry patrol he had ridden ahead of was less than half a day behind. They would arrive by morning, expecting his report on rumors of hostile activity in the area. What they would find instead was this massacre, and they would be looking for someone to blame. The logical course was clear. Wait with the survivor until the soldiers arrived, then return to the fort where Margaret Blackwood could be placed, under proper care. But instinct told him otherwise. The tracks he'd found told a story the army wouldn't want to hear, that white men had committed this atrocity while disguised as Crow. Once the patrol arrived, the truth would be buried beneath expedient lies, and the Apsaluk would suffer the consequences. And this woman, the only witness who could contradict the narrative, would be silenced, her advanced age making her testimony easy to dismiss as confusion or delusion. "There isn't time," Akecheta said finally. "More riders may come. We must go." Margaret stood her ground. "I will not leave my family unburied." Akecheta glanced at the western horizon, measuring the remaining daylight. "Then we work quickly." As twilight deepened into night, they dug shallow graves using tools salvaged from the wagons. Margaret insisted on saying words over each one, her voice growing hoarser but never breaking. For a woman who had lost everything mere hours before, her composure was remarkable. Only when they reached the smallest grave, that of her 4-year-old granddaughter, did she falter, her weathered hands pressing a rag doll into the earth alongside the child. Sarah was afraid of the dark, she explained simply. When the grim work was finished, Margaret stood before the row of graves, 17 in all. "What happens now?" she asked, turning to Akacheta. "The army patrol will arrive by morning. They will find signs suggesting Crow raiders and seek revenge. But it wasn't your people," Margaret stated with certainty. "I saw them clearly. White men with painted faces and feathers in their hats playing a part. I heard them speak to each other. One called another by name, Clayton." Akacheta's expression darkened. Clayton Mercer was a name he knew, a businessman from Helena with mining interests and a particular hatred for the tribes whose lands he coveted. "If you tell this to the army, some might believe you, others will not. Either way, Mercer has friends in high places. You would not be safe." Margaret considered this, her eyes returning to the fresh graves. "I've lived a long life, sir. Perhaps it's time I joined my family. Or perhaps you lived for a purpose," Akacheta countered, "to speak the truth of what happened here." "And who would listen to an old woman? My people would. The Apsaluk Council would hear your words." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, understanding dawning. "You're suggesting I go with you, to your people?" Akacheta nodded once. "To safety, until the truth can be known." Margaret Blackwood looked around at the remnants of her life. The shattered wagons, the scattered possessions, the row of fresh graves. Everything and everyone she had known was gone. What remained for her in the white man's world? A poorhouse, perhaps, or the reluctant charity of distant relations. "How far?" she asked finally. 2 days' journey to where my people camp for the summer. The way is difficult." Margaret straightened her bent frame as much as her aging spine would allow. "I crossed half a continent to get here, young man. I suspect I can manage 2 more days." As they gathered what supplies could be salvaged, water, food, a blanket, Margaret paused beside a broken trunk. From it, she withdrew a small wooden box and a shawl, adding both to her meager bundle. "Medicines," she explained, seeing Akacheta's questioning look. "I was a healer back in Ohio. Old ways mostly, herbs and tinctures. Some call it superstition, but the sick don't argue when the fever breaks." Akacheta's estimation of the woman rose further. A healer would be respected among his people, regardless of her age or origin. They left as the moon rose, following a route that would keep them hidden from the approaching patrol. Margaret rode the only surviving horse from the wagon train, a placid mare that had bolted during the attack and returned afterward. Akacheta walked ahead, setting a pace that respected Margaret's age while putting necessary distance between them and the massacre site. As they crested a rise, Margaret turned for a final look at the place that had claimed her family. "I always told Thomas that going west was tempting Providence," she said quietly, "but he had dreams of a better life for his children." "Dreams are not wrong," Akacheta replied. "The wrong lies with men who destroy them." They traveled through the night, stopping only when Margaret's strength began to falter. At a small creek sheltered by cottonwoods, Akacheta built a fire small enough to avoid detection, but sufficient to ward off the night's chill. Margaret eased herself to the ground, her joints protesting the unaccustomed activity. "Tell me about your people," she requested, as Akacheta offered her a strip of dried meat from his provisions. "The Apsaluk are known to your people as Crow," he began, settling across from her. "We are horsemen and hunters. Our territory stretches from here to the Beartooth Mountains and beyond. And your family? My father is Medicine Caller, an elder of the Mountain Crow Band. My mother is Little Weasel Woman of the River Crow. I have 2 sisters and a brother. My grandmother, Walks Far Woman, is a dream interpreter for our people. Margaret nodded, absorbing this information with the same calm attention she might have given a neighbor's family news back in Ohio. "And how did you come to be a scout for the army? Your English is excellent." A shadow crossed Akacheta's face. "7 winters ago, I was taken to the white man's school at the mission. They thought to remake us in their image." He gestured to his cavalry scout clothing. "In some ways, they succeeded, but the heart remains Apsaluk. And you're scouting. Surely that puts you between 2 worlds." "It does. I see what approaches before it arrives. This serves my people, even when the army believes I serve only them." Margaret studied him thoughtfully. A dangerous position. Less dangerous than ignorance. By knowing the army's movements, I can help my people avoid unnecessary conflict. And yet here you are, risking everything to help an old woman who should have died with her family. Margaret's direct gaze held him. "Why?" Akacheta stared into the small fire, considering his answer carefully. "The massacre was meant to provoke war against my people. You are the only witness who knows the truth. Your survival may prevent much bloodshed." "A practical reason," Margaret acknowledged. "But not, I think, the only one." Akacheta met her eyes. "No, not the only one." He didn't elaborate, and Margaret didn't press further. Instead, she opened her wooden box of medicines and extracted a small packet of herbs. "For pain," she explained, adding a pinch to her cup. "Of water. Old bones complain loudly about such adventures." As she drank the bitter mixture, Akacheta observed their surroundings with vigilant attention. The night remained quiet, but he knew the danger was far from past. By now, the army patrol would have discovered the massacre site. By morning, they would be searching for survivors or suspects. "Rest," he advised Margaret. "Tomorrow's journey will be more difficult. We must avoid open ground." Margaret settled onto the blanket he provided, her Bible tucked securely beside her. Despite everything, she fell asleep almost immediately, exhaustion overcoming even grief. Akacheta maintained his watch through the night, alert to every sound in the darkness. Dawn broke grey and misty, providing welcome cover as they resumed their journey. Margaret moved more stiffly than the previous evening, but made no complaint. As Akacheta helped her mount the mare, her resilience continued to impress him. Many younger people would have been broken by the trauma she had endured. They traveled through increasingly rugged country, keeping to ravines and wooded areas wherever possible. By midday, the terrain had changed from open prairie to rolling. The foothills dotted with pine and spruce. Margaret observed the transformation with interest, pointing out medicinal plants she recognized along the way. "That one there," she indicated a flowering shrub, "makes a tea that soothes coughs, and those roots, properly prepared, reduce fever." "You have knowledge similar to our medicine women," Akacheta noted. "Knowledge belongs to no one," Margaret replied. "The plants offer their healing to anyone wise enough to learn their ways." As they paused to rest in the shade of a rocky outcropping, Margaret withdrew a small daguerreotype from inside her Bible, a family portrait showing her son, daughter-in-law, and their 3 children. She traced their faces gently with one finger. "Thomas was 43, she said, breaking the silence. "His wife, Rebecca, is 38. The children, William was 11, James 9, and little Sarah just 4. She spoke matter-of-factly, as if reciting facts could keep the grief at bay. "Thomas was a carpenter, good with his hands. Rebecca taught school before they married." Akacheta listened respectfully, understanding the importance of naming the dead, of affirming that they had lived and been loved, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "And they were good people," Margaret continued. "Not perfect. Thomas had his father's temper and Rebecca worried too much about appearances. But they were kind. They didn't deserve such an end." "Few do," Akacheta replied simply. Margaret returned the photograph to its place. I should have died with them. It would have been proper. Yet here you are. Yes, here I am, because I wandered off to gather herbs while everyone else was setting up camp." A bitter laugh escaped her. "My daughter-in-law was always complaining about my foraging expeditions, as she called them. Said it wasn't dignified at my age to be crawling around in the dirt like a child. But those herbs kept her children healthy through 2 winters. She paused, her gaze distant. "When I heard the first shots, I was too far away to help. All I could do was hide and listen to my family die." "You survived," Akecheta said firmly. "That is not a small thing." "Survival," Margaret echoed, testing the word. "Is it enough?" "It is the beginning." They continued their journey as afternoon stretched toward evening. The terrain grew steeper, challenging even on horseback. Twice they had to dismount and lead the mare through difficult passages. Margaret's strength began to flag noticeably, though she pushed ahead with grim determination. As dusk approached, Akecheta called a halt beside a small spring that bubbled from the hillside. "We will rest here for the night," he decided, helping Margaret from the saddle. "Tomorrow we will reach my people's summer camp by midday." Margaret sank gratefully to the ground, her breathing labored. The day's exertion had clearly taken a toll on her aging body. From her medicine box, she extracted another packet of herbs, different from the previous nights. "For the heart," she explained, catching Akecheta's concerned glance. "I'm not accustomed to such excitement anymore." While Margaret rested, Akecheta constructed a more substantial shelter than the previous nights, using pine boughs to create a windbreak around a small clearing. The higher elevation brought cooler temperatures, and Margaret's age made her vulnerable to the night chill. As they shared a simple meal of dried meat and berries gathered along the way, Margaret asked the question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "What reception can I expect from your people? An elderly white woman is hardly a welcome guest in most Indian camps, I imagine." "There will be suspicion," Akecheta acknowledged honestly. "Fear, perhaps, from some. But you come under my protection, and my father's position as elder carries weight. And when they learn why you've brought me, that will depend on how the council interprets your presence. Some will see the wisdom in hearing your testimony about the massacre. Others will view you as a threat, a white person, in our sacred summer grounds." Margaret absorbed this with the same practical acceptance she had shown throughout their journey. "I've faced skeptical audiences before. When I began practicing healing arts in Ohio, many called me a witch or worse. One becomes accustomed to suspicious looks." "It may be more than looks," Akecheta warned. "Some warriors have lost family to white settlers' guns. Their anger runs deep, as would mine in their position." Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. "I have no illusions about my welcome, young man, but I have nowhere else to go, and a truth that needs telling. That will have to be enough." As night fully descended, bringing with it a canopy of stars more brilliant than Margaret had ever seen in the east, she found herself studying her unlikely protector more carefully. Akecheta tended the small fire with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise. Despite his army scout attire, there was nothing military in his bearing. Rather, he possessed the relaxed alertness of a natural hunter. "How old are you?" she asked suddenly. 28 winters, he replied. "Younger than my Thomas," she mused, "yet you seem much older in some ways. My people count wisdom in experiences, not years." A sensible approach. Margaret's eyes crinkled slightly, the closest she had come to a smile since he'd found her. "By that measure, I should be very wise indeed. Are you not?" "Wisdom would have kept me from climbing into a wagon bound for Montana," she replied dryly. "Wisdom would have insisted Thomas stay in Ohio where it was safe." "Safety is an illusion," Akecheta said, poking the fire. "In Ohio or Montana or anywhere, the Upsaluk understand this. We do not seek permanent safety, but rather to move with the dangers as they come. Like flowing water around rocks, Margaret murmured. My grandmother, my father's mother, was Cherokee. She spoke similarly before they forced her people. West on the trail where they cried, Akecheta looked up sharply, reassessing the elderly woman before him. You have native blood. A quarter, though you'd never know it to look at me. I favor my mother's Scottish side in appearance. Margaret touched her white hair self-consciously. My grandmother taught me about plants before they took her away. I was only 7, but I remembered everything. This new information shifted something in Akecheta's perception. Not that it changed his determination to protect her. That had been decided the moment he found her alive among the dead. But it added another dimension to the story they would present to his people. This connection may help when we reach the summer camp, he said thoughtfully. Not all will consider it significant, but some will see the pattern in it. Pattern? That you were spared for a purpose, that you bring knowledge of both worlds. Margaret considered this, her practical nature warring with the mystical implications. I was spared because I wandered off at the right moment, she said finally. If there's purpose in that, it's beyond my understanding. Understanding comes with time, Akecheta replied, adding another small branch to the fire. For now, rest is more important. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. As Margaret settled onto her blanket, Bible clutched to her chest like a shield, Akecheta maintained his vigil. The night was peaceful, broken only by the occasional call of a night bird or the distant howl of a wolf. Yet he remained alert, aware that they were still within range of army patrols, searching for survivors of the massacre or pursuing those they believed responsible. His decision to bring Margaret to his people carried significant risk. If the army discovered he had taken a survivor to an Apsea-Luke camp rather than returning her to the fort, he would be branded a traitor at best, a kidnapper at worst. His position as scout would be forfeit, along with the valuable intelligence it provided his people. Yet leaving her to the mercy of men like Clayton Mercer had been unthinkable. Something in the elderly woman's dignity and resilience had demanded his protection. Perhaps it was her age, the Apsea-Luke revered their elders as keepers of essential knowledge. Perhaps it was her status as a healer, a role his people particularly respected, or perhaps he admitted to himself as the night deepened around them. It was simply that Margaret Blackwood had looked at him with eyes that saw a man, not a friendly Indian or a useful tool. Whatever the reason, their paths were now joined, at least until she could safely tell her story. What came after that remained to be seen. Dawn broke cold and misty over the foothills, the rising sun barely penetrating the fog that clung to the landscape. Margaret awoke stiff and aching, each joint protesting the previous day's exertions. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, she reached for her customary chair beside Thomas's wagon. Then reality crashed back. The wagon was gone. Thomas was gone. Everyone was gone. You slept deeply, Akecheta commented, already alert and watchful beside a small, rekindled fire. Dreams came to you. Margaret pushed herself to a sitting position, surprised by his observation. How did you know? Your face showed it. Was it your family? Yes and no, she replied, accepting the cup of hot liquid he offered. It wasn't coffee, but some kind of herbal tea. I dreamed of Ohio, of the farm where I raised Thomas after his father died. She sipped the tea, its unfamiliar but pleasant flavor warming her from within. The dream had been vivid. The white farmhouse with green shutters, the apple orchard behind it, Thomas as a boy running through fields of wheat. Not memories exactly, but distillations of 30 years condensed into fleeting images. I was a young bride when we settled that land, Margaret continued, finding strange comfort in speaking of the past. just 17. My husband, Jeremiah, was 26. He'd fought in the Mexican War and received a land grant as compensation. Akasheta listened attentively as he prepared a small breakfast of dried berries and meat. Hard work, breaking new soil, Margaret recalled. But good years, those early ones. Jeremiah built the house with his own hands. We planted orchards, raised cattle. Thomas was born in our second year there. Should have had more children, but complications from his birth made that impossible. She ran her fingers over the worn cover of her Bible. Inside, the family record listed births, marriages, and deaths in fading ink, generations of Blackwoods whose stories she carried alone. Jeremiah died when Thomas was 12. Influenza. I kept the farm going by myself after that. A note of pride entered her voice. People said a woman couldn't manage such a property alone, especially with my peculiar ways of healing. But we thrived, Thomas and I. Your medicine helped you survive, Akacheta observed. That and stubbornness, Margaret agreed with a faint smile. The Blackwood family trait. My husband had it. Thomas inherited it. His children too, especially little Sarah. Her voice caught slightly on the name. She would argue with the wind. If she thought it was blowing wrong, Akacheta offered her more tea, which she accepted gratefully. The morning chill aggravated her arthritis, making her fingers clumsy as she held the cup. "When did you leave this farm?" he asked. "Last spring." Thomas had been talking about Montana for years. Gold in the streams, land for the taking, opportunities for a carpenter with his skills. I always discouraged it. What need had he have for gold when the farm would be his one day? Margaret shook her head at the memory, but Rebecca had her heart set on a grander life than Ohio could offer. And after last year's drought damaged our crops, Thomas saw it as a sign to make the change. She looked down at her weathered hands, mapped with veins and spotted with age. I sold the farm. Everything we couldn't carry went to auction. Neighbors thought I was mad to attempt such a journey at my age. Yet you went. What choice did I have? Thomas was my only child. His children are my only grandchildren. The thought of never seeing them again. She trailed off, the irony of her situation not lost on her. So, I packed my medicines, said goodbye to graves I'd tended for decades, and climbed into a wagon bound for a place I never wanted to see. Akacheta began dismantling their small camp, erasing signs of their presence with practiced efficiency. "We should continue soon. The patrol may have picked up our trail," Margaret nodded, struggling to her feet. Her body protested every movement, the combined effects of age, grief, and unfamiliar exertion, making even simple tasks challenging. Seeing her difficulty, Akacheta paused in his work to offer assistance, which she accepted with reluctant gratitude. Chapter, "My head, I'm still 40, she confessed as he helped her to the waiting horse. "It's always a surprise when my body reminds me otherwise." As they resumed their journey, Margaret found herself studying her companion with growing curiosity. In the early morning light, details she hadn't noticed the previous day became apparent. The intricate braiding of his hair, the subtle patterns etched into his leather belt, the small medicine pouch that hung at his neck. "You said your grandmother is a dream interpreter," she remarked as they navigated a narrow ravine. "What does that mean among your people?" Akacheta considered his response carefully, as though deciding how much to share. "Dreams are messages," he said finally, "from ancestors, from spirits, from parts of ourselves that see what the waking eye cannot. Walking Far Woman helps people understand these messages." "And does she interpret your dreams as well?" A shadow crossed his face. "When I allow it." Something in his tone discouraged further questions on that particular subject. Instead, Margaret asked about his childhood, his family, his life before becoming a scout. Gradually, as they traveled through increasingly rugged terrain, Akacheta's story emerged in measured pieces. Born to a respected family within the Mountain Crow Band, his early years had been traditional, learning to ride almost before he could walk, accompanying hunting parties by age 8, developing the skills expected of an Apsayaluk warrior. His father, Medicine Caller, was known for his ability to communicate with animals, particularly wolves, and had hoped his son would inherit this spiritual gift. But other plans intervened, Akacheta explained, as they paused to rest beneath a towering pine. When I was 15, soldiers came to our winter camp, not to fight, a different kind of invasion. They brought papers from Washington, spoke of education and opportunity. The mission school, Margaret surmised. Akacheta nodded. 5 boys from each band were to be sent. A gesture of cooperation, they called it. My father opposed it, but the council was divided. Some believed learning white ways might help protect our future, and so you went. Not by choice, but once chosen, I decided to learn everything they offered. Their language, their writing, their ways of thinking. Knowledge is never wasted, even from enemies. You consider all whites enemies? Margaret asked, though without offense. Akacheta helped her remount the horse before responding. I consider any people who would take children from their families, to civilize them capable of greater cruelties. But no, not all whites are enemies. Some, like the missionary who taught me English, showed kindness within their limited understanding. They continued their journey in thoughtful silence, climbing steadily into higher countries. By mid-morning, they had reached a ridge that offered views in all directions. Rolling foothills giving way to mountains in the north and east, open plains stretching away to the south and west. Akacheta paused, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. Margaret followed his gaze and spotted what had caught his attention, a distant plume of dust moving across the plains below. Riders, perhaps a dozen, following the route they had taken the previous night. The patrol, Akacheta confirmed grimly. They've found our trail sooner than expected. Can they track us this far? Their Pawnee scout could. If motivated, we must move faster now. The pace he set tested Margaret's endurance severely. They abandoned established game trails for rougher terrain, crossed streams multiple times to break their scent trail, and took routes that required Margaret to dismount and lead the horse through narrow passages. By midday, exhaustion had settled into her bones like winter frost when they finally stopped to rest in a sheltered hollow beside a small spring. Margaret sank to the ground in a heap of aching limbs and labored breathing. From her medicine box, she withdrew a small vial containing a tincture of foxglove, a remedy she used sparingly for her occasionally faltering heart. I fear I'm slowing our journey considerably, she admitted, after the medicine had steadied her pulse. Perhaps you should continue alone and send help back for me. Akacheta shook his head firmly. We stay together. The summer camp is not far. No draced, perhaps 4 hours' journey at our current pace. And will your people welcome me when we arrive? The question that had hovered between them since the beginning needed answering now that their destination grew near. Some will not, Akacheta replied honestly. But you will be under the protection of my family, which carries weight. And your skills as a healer may help overcome fear. Margaret nodded, accepting this reality. In my experience, people are people, regardless of race, some kind, some cruel, most somewhere in between. A wise observation, Akacheta agreed, offering her a strip of dried meat and a handful of berries from his provisions. My father often says that human nature is the same in every tribe, only customs differ. As they ate their sparse meal, Margaret found herself contemplating the strange turns of fate that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a respected widow in Ohio, tending her garden and treating neighbors' ailments. Now she was a homeless survivor, dependent on the protection of a man whose people had been portrayed as savages in every newspaper and dime novel she'd ever encountered. "Life has a peculiar sense of direction," she mused aloud. "All those years I resisted Thomas's talk of Montana, and here I am after all, though hardly in the circumstances I'd have chosen. The path reveals itself one step at a time," Akecheta responded. "My grandmother would say you are exactly where the spirits intended you to be." "And what would you say?" He considered this, his expression thoughtful. "I would say that survival creates its own purpose. You lived when others died. There is meaning in that, whether placed there by spirits or created by what you choose to do with the life that remains." His words stirred something in Margaret. Not comfort exactly, but a sense of possibility that had been buried beneath. Her grief, she had survived. What that meant, what purpose it might serve, remained to be discovered. They resumed their journey with renewed determination, following an increasingly narrow trail that wound through stands of lodgepole pine and across small rushing streams fed by mountain snowmelt. The terrain grew more challenging, but Margaret found her second wind, the brief rest and food reviving her strength. As they traveled, Akecheta shared more about the Apsaluk summer camp they were approaching. Unlike the permanent settlements of eastern tribes, the Crow moved seasonally, following game and adjusting to weather patterns. The summer camp occupied a hidden valley with plentiful water and good grazing for horses, a traditional site used for generations. "My people will be preparing for the approaching fall ceremony," he explained, "the last major gathering before winter bands separate for the cold months." "What does this ceremony entail?" Margaret asked, her healer's curiosity piqued by any mention of cultural traditions. 4 days of prayer, dancing, and renewal of tribal bonds, healing ceremonies for the sick, recognition of children born since the previous gathering, honoring those who have walked on to the spirit world. Margaret absorbed this information with interest. Despite her weariness and grief, the part of her that had always been drawn to knowledge, especially of healing practices, stirred with curiosity. "This ceremony, does it include medicinal practices?" Akecheta nodded. "The medicine people prepare special remedies, perform healings. Knowledge is exchanged between healers of different bands who may not see each other again until spring. And would these healers share their knowledge with an outsider? That would depend on the individual and on you. Some knowledge is sacred, meant only for those born to the way. Other remedies might be shared, especially if you offer knowledge in return." The potential for such exchange rekindled a spark in Margaret that grief had nearly extinguished. Throughout her life, she had collected healing practices from diverse sources. Her Cherokee grandmother, immigrant neighbors, medical texts she'd bartered eggs to obtain. The opportunity to learn from Crow medicine people represented a continuation of this lifelong pursuit. By late afternoon, they had entered a narrow canyon whose walls rose steeply on either side. The trail, barely visible even to Akecheta's experienced eye, followed a small stream that bubbled over rocky terrain. The confined space amplified the sound of water and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. "We are close now," Akecheta informed her, his demeanor subtly shifting as they neared his people's territory. "Beyond this canyon lies Elk Valley, where the summer camp is established." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety at this announcement. Soon she would face an entire community whose language she didn't speak, whose customs she didn't know, and who had every reason to view her with suspicion or hostility. "What should I expect?" she asked, straightening her disheveled appearance as best she could. "Is there a protocol I should follow?" "Allow me to speak first," Akecheta advised. "Keep your eyes downcast initially. Direct stares can be interpreted as challenging. Accept food or drink if offered. Refusal would be an insult. These instructions reminded Margaret of her childhood in Kentucky, where her mother had drilled her in proper behavior for social calls. Different details, similar principle, respect shown through adherence to local custom. My father will want to hear your story directly, Akacheta continued. He speaks some English, though not as fluently as I do. My grandmother understands more than she speaks. Others in the council may require translation. And should I mention my Cherokee grandmother? Akacheta considered this question carefully. Yes, but do not claim her heritage as your own. Acknowledge the connection without presuming it makes you one of us. Margaret nodded, understanding the nuance. Her distant native ancestry was a fact of her lineage, but she had been raised in white culture, lived a white woman's life. To pretend otherwise would be disingenuous. As they approached the end of the narrow canyon, Akacheta signaled for her to halt. Ahead, partially concealed in the shadows of late afternoon, stood two mounted figures. Sentries, Margaret realized, guarding the approach to the valley beyond. Akacheta raised his hand in greeting and called out in the Crow language. The response, though unintelligible to Margaret, clearly contained surprise and concern. A brief exchange followed, during which one of the sentries repeatedly gestured toward her with evident alarm. Finally, Akacheta turned to Margaret. They will allow us to pass, but news of your arrival will precede us. Be prepared for attention. I've been the subject of gossip before, Margaret replied with more confidence than she felt. In a small Ohio town, a widow who heals with herbs provides endless fodder for speculation. Akacheta's expression suggested that the reception awaiting her might surpass anything she had experienced in Ohio, but he merely nodded and motioned for her to follow him past the guards. As they emerged from the canyon into the valley beyond, Margaret drew a sharp breath at the vista before her. Nestled between towering mountains, a broad valley stretched away to the north, its lush grasslands dotted with cottonwood groves and bisected by a clear, winding river. On a plateau overlooking this river stood the Apsayaluk summer camp, dozens of teepees arranged in a great circle, with larger structures at its center. Horses grazed in meadows beyond the camp, hundreds of them in various herds. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and even at this distance, Margaret could see people moving about their daily tasks. Children played near the river's edge, women worked at outdoor tasks, men gathered in small groups engaged in conversation or crafts. It was a scene of settled communal life that contradicted every stereotype of wild Indians that permeated Eastern. Newspapers, your home, Margaret said simply. For now, Akacheta confirmed, until the first snow drives us to the winter grounds. As they approached the outskirts of the camp, activity gradually ceased. People stopped their work to stare at. The extraordinary sight, Akacheta, known to all as a scout for the army, leading an elderly white woman on horseback into their sacred summer grounds. Margaret felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, sensing the mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility in many gazes. Children were hurriedly gathered by protective parents. Warriors moved subtly to place themselves between her and the women and children. Through it all, Margaret maintained the dignity that had carried her through 7 decades of life's trials. Back straight despite her exhaustion, head held at a respectful angle, as Akacheta had advised. She followed him toward the center of the camp, where a group of elders had already begun to assemble, alerted by runners from the canyon entrance. Remember, Akacheta murmured as they approached this gathering, you survived for a reason. Carry that truth with you now. Margaret touched the Bible she still carried, drawing strength from its familiar presence. I'm ready, she replied, though her racing heart suggested otherwise. The journey that had begun at a massacre site was about to enter a new phase, one that would test not only her courage but her capacity to build understanding across the chasm that separated her world from the one whose threshold she now crossed. At the center of the Apsar-Luk summer camp stood a council lodge, larger than the surrounding teepees. Before this impressive structure, 7 elders had assembled, seated in a semicircle on buffalo robes spread across the packed earth. Their faces, etched with the wisdom of decades, revealed nothing as Akecheta guided Margaret forward. She dismounted, with difficulty, her aged joints protesting after the long journey. A young boy appeared to take charge of the horse, eyeing Margaret with undisguised curiosity before leading the animal away. Akecheta spoke in Crow, his voice carrying the formal tones of a ceremonial address. Though Margaret couldn't understand the words, she recognized an explanation being offered, occasionally hearing what she assumed was her name interspersed with unfamiliar terms. One elder, a man whose silver hair was adorned with eagle feathers, and whose face bore the deep lines of perhaps 80 years, raised his hand, silencing Akecheta mid-sentence. He studied Margaret intently before speaking in halting English. "Woman who survives, why did you come to Apsar-Luk?" Margaret straightened her bent frame as much as her arthritis would allow, meeting the elder's gaze with respectful directness. "I come seeking sanctuary," she replied clearly, "and to tell the truth of what happened to my family." Akecheta translated her words, adding context that Margaret could only guess at. A murmur passed through the gathering crowd, which had grown to include much of the camp's population. The elder nodded thoughtfully before addressing her again. "I am a medicine caller. Father of Akecheta, you stay in my lodge tonight. Tomorrow the council hears your words." Relief washed over Margaret. This initial reception, while not warm, offered at least temporary acceptance. She inclined her head in gratitude. "Thank you for your hospitality." A woman stepped forward from the edge of the circle, elderly like Margaret, but moving with the fluid grace of someone at peace with their aging body. Her silver-streaked hair hung in twin braids adorned with shell beads, and her keen eyes missed nothing as she examined the newcomer. "My grandmother walks far, woman," Akecheta explained. The woman spoke rapidly to her grandson, who replied with deference. Though Margaret couldn't understand their exchange, she recognized the evaluating gaze of a fellow healer, one who could assess a person's well-being at a glance. "She says you need food, rest, and medicine for your heart," Akecheta translated. "She offers her lodge for your care." Before Margaret could respond, another voice cut through the growing murmurs of the crowd, sharp, angry, and male. A warrior in his prime pushed forward, speaking vehemently in Crow while gesturing toward Margaret with unmistakable hostility. Medicine Caller listened impassively before responding with quiet authority. The younger man continued his protest, but with diminished force. "2 dogs," Akecheta muttered to Margaret. "He lost his brother to a settler's bullet last hunting season. He questions your presence here." "A reasonable concern," Margaret acknowledged, understanding the man's anger. She had encountered similar grief-fueled rage before, though usually directed at fever or accident rather than human enemies. Medicine Caller spoke again, his authoritative tone ending the confrontation. 2 dogs retreated, though his expression promised that the matter wasn't settled. The elder then gestured to Walk's Far woman, who stepped forward to guide Margaret away from the gathering. "Go with my grandmother," Akecheta advised. "I must speak with the council more fully about what we found at Whispering Grass." Walk's Far woman led Margaret through the camp toward a tipi set slightly apart from the others. The stares of the community followed them. Some curious, many suspicious, a few openly hostile. Children ducked behind their mothers when Margaret passed, while young warriors fingered weapon hafts with pointed intent. "Don't be troubled," an unexpected voice said in English. Margaret turned to find a young woman walking beside them, perhaps 20 years old, with intelligent eyes and an open expression. "I am Bright Water, daughter of Medicine Caller's second wife. I learned English at the mission school." "You're Akecheta's sister?" Margaret asked. The young woman nodded. Half-sister, same father, different mothers. I will help translate while you are with us. Walksfar woman spoke rapidly to Brightwater, who then turned to Margaret. My grandmother asks if you can walk a little farther or if you need to rest. She sees your pain. I can continue, Margaret assured them, though in truth each step was an exercise in endurance. Pride kept her moving, and perhaps a healer's curiosity about what awaited in the old woman's lodge. The tepee they entered was spacious and well-ordered. Hides covered the floor, and a small fire burned in the central pit, venting through the open top of the conical structure. Bundles of dried plants hung from the supporting poles, filling the air with aromatic scents that Margaret's trained nose immediately began to catalogue. Sage, sweetgrass, what might be valerian root. Walksfar woman gestured for Margaret to sit on a pile of soft furs, then spoke to Brightwater while gathering items from various pouches and baskets. My grandmother says you must eat, then rest, Brightwater translated. She is preparing medicine for your journey-tired body. A wooden bowl was placed in Margaret's hands, containing a rich stew of meat and wild roots. The first bite awakened hunger she'd been suppressing, and she ate with surprising appetite. Your grandmother is a healer, Margaret observed between mouthfuls. Brightwater nodded. One of our most respected medicine women. She knows plants, dreams, and women's medicine especially. Walksfar woman worked methodically, grinding dried herbs with a stone mortar and adding the powder to a small clay cup of hot water. The familiar actions, so similar to Margaret's own practices, created an unexpected bridge between the cultures. When Margaret finished eating, the elderly crow woman knelt before her, offering the medicinal tea with both hands. Their eyes met over the steaming cup, and Margaret recognized the universal expression of one healer to another, concern mixed with professional interest. She asks that you drink it all, Brightwater translated. Margaret nodded in understanding and sipped the bitter concoction. Years of preparing similar remedies had accustomed her to medicinal flavors, and she recognized some ingredients. Willow bark for pain, something like hawthorn that would ease her stressed heart. As the medicine began to take effect, a profound weariness overcame her. Walksfar woman and Brightwater helped her to a sleeping pallet of soft hides, removing her worn shoes and covering her with a light blanket. Rest now, Brightwater said softly. Tomorrow will bring many questions. Margaret wanted to ask about her belongings, the precious medicine box and Bible especially, but exhaustion claimed her before she could form the words. She slipped into deep sleep, the first truly safe rest she'd experienced since the massacre. She awoke to soft morning, light filtering through the teepee's smoke hole. For a disorienting moment she struggled to place herself, the unfamiliar dwelling, the scent of herbs and wood smoke, the distant sounds of a community beginning its day. You slept through the night and half the morning. Brightwater's voice came from nearby. The young woman sat cross-legged by the central fire, where a small pot simmered. My grandmother says this is good. Your body needed healing rest. Margaret pushed herself to a sitting position, surprised to find her arthritic pain significantly diminished. Whatever had been in Walksfar woman's medicine had worked more effectively than her own remedies. Where is your grandmother now? She asked. Attending the naming ceremony for a new baby, Brightwater explained, offering Margaret a cup of herbal tea. She will return soon. Today the council will hear your story. My things. Safe here, Brightwater assured her, indicating Margaret's Bible, medicine box, and small bundle of possessions arranged neatly nearby. My grandmother respects medicine tools and sacred objects. Margaret sipped the tea, using the quiet moment to collect her thoughts. Today, she would need to speak painful truths to strangers whose language she didn't share. The responsibility weighed heavily, not just for her own safety, but for the absolute people potentially threatened by false blame for the massacre. "May I ask you something?" Brightwater said, interrupting Margaret's thoughts. "Of course. Akecheta says you are a healer among your people. Is this true?" Margaret nodded. "For most of my life, yes. I learned first from my grandmother, who was Cherokee, then from books and other healers I encountered." Brightwater's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Cherokee heritage. "This explains a lot. Grandmother sensed you carried medical knowledge when she first saw you. Your grandmother is very perceptive," Margaret acknowledged. "The medicine she gave me last night was more effective for my joints than anything I've used before." This observation clearly pleased Brightwater, who smiled. "For the first time, she will want to know this. Perhaps you can share knowledge during your stay." The potential for such exchange offered Margaret an unexpected purpose. Throughout her life, healing knowledge had been her anchor through personal tragedies and challenges. Perhaps here, among people who respected such wisdom, it could serve her again. Walk's Far woman returned shortly thereafter, bringing with her the aroma of sage smudge from the naming ceremony. She assessed Margaret with a healer's keen eye before speaking to Brightwater. "Grandmother asks how you feel this morning," the young woman translated. "Much improved," Margaret replied honestly. "Please tell her my gratitude for her effective medicine." When this was translated, Walk's Far woman nodded with professional satisfaction. She spoke again, longer this time. "She says the council gathers at midday to hear your story," Brightwater explained. "Before then you should eat and prepare yourself. She has brought clean clothing more suitable than your torn dress." The offered garment was a simple buckskin dress, decorated with minimal beadwork along the neckline, practical rather than ceremonial. Though accepting clothing from these people felt like another step away from her former life, Margaret recognized the necessity. Her own dress was filthy and torn beyond repair. With Brightwater's assistance, she changed into the buckskin garment. It had clearly been made for a younger woman, but adapted hastily to accommodate Margaret's elderly frame. Despite the imperfect fit, the soft leather felt surprisingly comfortable against her skin. Walk's Far woman then produced a small clay pot containing a reddish paste, gesturing toward Margaret's face with questioning hands. "What is this for?" Margaret asked. "Protection paint," Brightwater explained. "For council meetings, it shows you come in peace but with dignity." Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding her consent. She had come seeking sanctuary among these people. Accepting their customs represented both practical wisdom and respectful acknowledgement of her dependent status. With practiced hands, Walk's Far woman applied the red ochre in simple lines across Margaret's cheekbones and forehead. The cool paste felt strangely comforting, like a mask that might lend her strength for the ordeal ahead. As midday approached, Akecheta arrived to escort Margaret to the council. He had exchanged his scout uniform for traditional crow dress, buckskin leggings, a beaded vest over a cotton shirt, and moccasins adorned with porcupine quill work. The transformation was striking. He seemed more fully himself in these clothes, his military bearing replaced by a natural dignity. "You look rested," he observed. "My grandmother's medicine is strong." "Remarkably effective," Margaret agreed. "I feel better than I have in months." They walked together toward the council lodge, Brightwater accompanying them as translators. The camp's daily activities slowed as they passed, people pausing to watch with undisguised interest. The same mixture of emotions Margaret had noted the previous day remained: curiosity, suspicion, hostility, but perhaps with slightly less intensity. The council includes representatives from all 3 crow bands currently at the summer camp, Akecheta explained. Mountain crow, river crow, and kicked in the bellies. Each has different concerns and perspectives. "What should I expect?" Margaret asked. They will listen first, then ask questions. Answer truthfully but simply. Bright Water will translate, though several elders understand some English. The council lodge was impressive, larger than the family teepees and elaborately painted with symbols whose meanings Margaret could only guess at. Inside, a circle of 12 men and 3 women awaited them, seated on buffalo robes around a central fire. Medicine Caller occupied the position directly opposite the entrance, marking him as the principal elder. Margaret was guided to a place within the circle, but not of it, a clearly defined position as petitioner or witness. Akecheta stood behind her, while Brightwater knelt at her side to translate. Medicine Caller spoke, his deep voice filling the lodge with formal cadences. "My father welcomes you to the Council of the Apsayaluke," Brightwater translated. "He asks that you speak your truth plainly, without the twisted words white people often use. Tell us what happened at Whispering Grass, and why you seek shelter among those your kind considers enemies." Margaret took a deep breath, centering herself. "I will speak only the truth," she promised, meeting the elder's gaze directly. Over the next hour, she recounted the massacre in painful detail, the sudden attack, her fortuitous absence gathering, herbs, the deaths of her family members, and her desperate hiding beneath the burning wagon. She described the attackers clearly, emphasizing their disguises and the name she had overheard, Clayton Mercer. Akecheta added his observations about the tracks and evidence at the site, confirming that the attackers had been white men attempting to implicate the Crow. When he mentioned Mercer's connections to mining interests that sought access to Apsaluka territory, a murmur of understanding passed through the council. Questions followed, translated by Brightwater. How many attackers? What weapons did they carry? Could she identify any besides Mercer? Margaret answered as thoroughly as her memory allowed, aware that each detail might prove crucial to these people's safety. Finally, an elderly female council member spoke at length, her wizened face grave. Brightwater hesitated before translating. "Speckled. Bird asks why we should believe you," she said finally. "Many white women would say anything to save themselves, even accuse their own kind to gain favor." The question, though harsh, was fair. Margaret considered her response carefully. "I have lived 70 years, she replied, her voice steady. "I have buried a husband, watched my only son die reaching for me, and helped dig graves for my grandchildren. What remains for me to fear or gain? I seek no favor, only to ensure that those responsible for my family's deaths are held accountable, not innocent people who had no part in it." When this was translated, Speckled Bird nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with the response. Two Dogs, the warrior who had protested her arrival the previous day, spoke next. His words needed no translation. The aggressive tone and gestures toward the plains beyond the camp clearly questioned what would happen when the army discovered her whereabouts. Akecheta responded calmly, explaining something that caused considerable discussion among the council members. Brightwater leaned closer to Margaret. "He tells them that the army already believes all travelers were killed," she whispered. "To reveal your survival now would raise dangerous questions about where you've been and who helped you." The implications were clear. Margaret's sanctuary among the Apsaluke was as much for their protection as for hers. If the army discovered that Akecheta had brought a massacre survivor to his people rather than returning her to the fort, it would confirm white suspicions about Crow involvement. Medicine. Caller raised his hand, silencing the discussion. He spoke with quiet authority, his words carrying the weight of final judgment. "My father says you may remain with us until the moon when the leaves fall." Brightwater translated. "During this time, you will stay in my grandmother's lodge and learn our ways. When autumn comes, the council will decide what path opens before you." Relief flooded through Margaret. She had been granted sanctuary, at least temporarily. "Thank you," she said simply. "I will respect your customs and strive not to bring danger to your people." Medicine Caller continued, his expression stern. He says there are conditions, Brightwater explained. You must not leave the camp without an escort. You must learn our language. You must share your healing knowledge with our medicine women. And you must accept a Crow name, as you cannot be called by your white name here. These terms seemed reasonable, even generous under the circumstances. Margaret nodded her acceptance. I agree to these conditions. Medicine Caller spoke a final. In time, shorter now. He gives you the name Survives the Storm, Brightwater translated. It honors both your survival of the attack and the strength an elderly woman needs to endure such loss. The name settled over Margaret like a new garment, unfamiliar yet somehow fitting. Survives the Storm. A recognition of what she had endured and perhaps what still lay ahead. As the council disbanded, Walk's Far Woman approached, speaking to Brightwater while studying Margaret with evaluating eyes. Grandmother says you should rest today, the young woman translated. Tomorrow your new life begins. You will help her gather medicine plants, and she will begin teaching you our language. Tell her I'm grateful for her guidance, Margaret replied. As they left the council lodge, Margaret noticed a subtle shift in the community's response to her presence. The hostility remained in some quarters. 2 dogs and his supporters watched, with undisguised suspicion, but curiosity had largely replaced fear among others. Children no longer hid behind their mothers, instead staring openly at the strange white-haired woman in borrowed buckskins with red ochre on her face. Survives the Storm. The name echoed in her mind as she walked through the absolute summer camp. Past teepees and cooking fires, drying racks laden with meat, women scraping hides or weaving baskets. This world was utterly foreign to her 70 years of experience, yet she must adapt to it now, learn its language, customs, rhythms. The magnitude of the challenge might have overwhelmed a younger woman, but Margaret's lifetime of adjusting to hardship had prepared her for this final transformation. That evening, seated beside Walk's Far Woman's fire, she watched the elderly medicine woman sort through dried plants with practiced hands. Without words, the Crow healer indicated that Margaret should join her in this task. Taking a seat on the opposite side of the sorting mat, Margaret began to separate plants into piles according to type, recognizing some, uncertain of others. When she correctly identified and grouped a particular medicinal root, Walk's Far Woman nodded approvingly and spoke a single word, clearly naming the plant in Crow. Biexaliche, Margaret repeated carefully, committing the sound to memory. Walk's Far Woman smiled, the first real smile she had offered, and reached for another. Plant to name. In this simple exchange between 2 elderly healers from vastly different worlds, Margaret glimpsed the path forward. 1 word at a time, 1 plant at a time, 1 day at a time. Survival would continue, and perhaps eventually something more than mere survival might be possible. Days flowed into weeks as summer reached its golden peak in the absolute summer camp. For Margaret, now known to all as Survives the Storm, the passage of time brought gradual but significant changes. Her body, fortified by Walk's Far Woman's effective medicines and the camp's nourishing food, regained strength she had thought permanently lost to age. Her mind, engaged in the constant challenge of learning a new language and culture, remained sharp and adaptable. Each morning began the same way. Margaret would awaken at dawn to find Walk's Far Woman already active, tending the lodge fire or preparing the day's medicines. Together they would share a simple breakfast of dried berries, pemmican, and herbal tea. Then would come the language lessons, relentless, immersive, and surprisingly effective. Ashkishe, Walk's Far Woman would say, pointing to the sky. Ashkish, Margaret would repeat, sky. Bigul, pointing to the stars. Bigul, stars. The elderly Crow woman proved a demanding but patient teacher. She never repeated a word more than twice, expecting Margaret to remember it thereafter. Yet she showed genuine pleasure when her student correctly recalled previous lessons. By the end of the first month, Margaret had accumulated a functional vocabulary of nearly 300 Crow words, enough for basic communication without Brightwater's constant translation. On this particular morning, as summer's heat began, its subtle shift toward autumn walks far woman announced a change to their routine. "Today we go beyond camp borders," she explained in her limited English, supplemented by gestures and Crow words Margaret now understood. "Medicine plants wait in high meadows." The prospect both excited and intimidated Margaret. She had not left the immediate vicinity of the camp since her arrival, aware of the council's restriction on her movements. This opportunity to gather plants in the surrounding wilderness represented a significant expansion of her limited world and a test of the community's growing trust. Brightwater arrived as they prepared for the expedition, carrying a leather gathering bag and what appeared to be a walking stick carved from mountain ash. "For you," she explained, offering the staff to Margaret. "My father made it. He says even strong women need support on mountain paths." The gift startled Margaret. Medicine Caller, while never overtly hostile, had maintained a formal distance since approving her stay. This unexpected gesture suggested a shift in his assessment of her. "Thank him for his thoughtfulness," Margaret replied, accepting the staff. It was perfectly sized for her height, the top smooth to fit her hand comfortably. 3 other women joined their gathering party, an elderly medicine woman named Redwing from the River Crow Band, her daughter Swift Deer, and Swift Deer's 12-year-old daughter Little Fox. All 3 regarded Margaret with open curiosity rather than the suspicion that had marked earlier interactions. They set out as the morning mist still clung to the valley floor, following a narrow trail that wound upward through stands of lodgepole pine. Margaret used Medicine Caller's staff to good advantage, finding that it significantly eased the strain on her arthritic knees. Despite her improved health, steep terrain remained challenging for her 70-year-old joints. As they climbed, walks, Farwoman pointed out plants along the trail, naming each in Crow and explaining its uses. Margaret recognized many: yarrow, wild mint, mullein, though some were unfamiliar species unique to these mountains. This one, Walks Farwoman, indicated a flowering plant with delicate purple blossoms, heals lung sickness. "We dry flowers, make tea." Margaret knelt carefully to examine it, committing its appearance to memory. "We have something similar in the East, but with blue flowers. I used it for the same purpose." This exchange of knowledge had become their most effective form of communication, medicine wisdom bridging cultural and linguistic divides. While the Crow women remained careful about sharing certain sacred aspects of their healing traditions, practical remedies became common currency between them. By midday they had reached a high alpine meadow, carpeted with wildflowers and medicinal herbs. The vista was breathtaking, snow-capped peaks rising against the impossibly blue sky. The valley spread below them like a map, with the summer camp visible as a collection of tiny cones beside the silver ribbon of river. "Beautiful," Margaret murmured, momentarily overwhelmed by the grandeur. "Dashushia," Little Fox said beside her, using the Crow word for beautiful. The girl had attached herself to Margaret during the climb, initially maintaining a shy distance, but gradually moving closer until they walked side by side. "Dashushia," Margaret repeated, smiling at the child. Little Fox beamed at her proper pronunciation, then impulsively took Margaret's weathered hand in her small brown one. "I show you special medicine. Only grows here." This simple gesture of acceptance touched Margaret deeply. Children often reflected their community's true feelings, unfiltered by adult complexities. Little Fox's willingness to approach her, to teach her, suggested that at least some families in the camp had moved beyond seeing her merely as a dangerous outsider. The gathering work proceeded systematically, each woman focusing on specific plants according to her healing specialty. Margaret worked alongside Walk's Far Woman, learning to identify high-altitude varieties she had never encountered in Ohio's gentler landscape. The physical labor, bending, digging, cutting, tested her endurance, but she welcomed the challenge, recognizing how much stronger she had become under the crow healer's care. As they worked, Swift Deer approached Margaret with unexpected directness. "Your medicine saved my son," she said in halting English. Margaret looked up in surprise. "My medicine?" Swift Deer nodded. 3 sleeps passed. He had fever sickness. Grandmother Walk's Far Woman used your white medicine from a little box. She mimicked measuring a small amount of powder. Fever broke before morning. Realization dawned on Margaret. "The willow bark and bone-set mixture, I shared it with your mother-in-law last week." This revelation startled her. She had indeed shown Walk's Far Woman several of her herbal preparations, explaining their uses, but hadn't realized the crow healer would actually employ them to treat her own people. "It works good," Swift Deer affirmed. "Better than our old way for quick fever breaking." The simple acknowledgement represented something profound. The first concrete evidence that Margaret's presence offered tangible benefit to the community. Her medicinal knowledge, cultivated over decades in a world now lost to her, had preserved its value in this new context. By late afternoon, their gathering bags bulged with the day's harvest. As they prepared to descend, Red Wing approached Margaret, speaking in Crow with gestures that Brightwater translated. "She invites you to her lodge tomorrow to help prepare these medicines," the young woman explained. "It is an honor. Red Wing rarely shares her medicine-making with outsiders." "I would be grateful for the opportunity," Margaret replied, understanding the significance of the invitation. Red Wing, unlike Walk's Far Woman, had no particular reason to include her in sacred healing work. This represented a choice based on professional respect, rather than familial obligation. Their return journey to camp took them along a different trail that passed a small, crystal-clear lake nestled between rocky outcroppings. Little Fox ran ahead, calling excitedly for Margaret to follow. At the lake's edge, the girl pointed to petroglyphs carved into the smooth stone face, ancient images of animals, hunters, and symbols whose meanings had faded with time. "Old ones made these," Little Fox explained in mixed English and Crow. "Before Apsaluke came to these mountains, they tell stories." Margaret studied the weathered images with fascination. Who were they, these old ones? Brightwater, joining them by the rock face, translated this question for Redwing, who responded at length. "She says these mountains have known many peoples," Brightwater explained. "Before the Apsaluke, other tribes lived here, Shoshone, Blackfeet, and others whose names are lost. The oldest carvings may be from those who had no name we remember." This perspective, of land that had witnessed the passage of multiple peoples, each leaving their mark before moving on, struck Margaret forcefully. Her own culture's notion of permanent settlement and fixed ownership seemed suddenly presumptuous in the face of such ancient patterns of migration and change. As they continued toward camp, Margaret found herself walking beside Redwing, who studied her with the same evaluating gaze Walk's Far Woman had used when they first met. After a thoughtful silence, the elderly medicine woman spoke in heavily accented English. "You have medicine eyes," she said, tapping her own eyes for emphasis. "See beyond the surface, important for healing." "Thank you," Margaret replied, touched by the professional acknowledgement. "I've tried to see clearly all my life." Redwing nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. "Tomorrow, we work together. You show me white medicine ways, I show you Apsaluk secrets. Good trade." This simple proposition, knowledge exchanged for knowledge, respect for respect, embodied the most promising aspect of Margaret's unexpected life among the Crow. Where words failed and cultural assumptions clashed, the universal language of healing provided common ground. They returned to camp as the sun dipped toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. The day's normal activities were winding down, cooking fires, sending plumes of smoke skyward, children being called to evening meals, horses being brought in from distant pastures. Margaret noticed immediately that something had changed during their absence. Men on horseback moved at the camp's perimeter in patterns that suggested heightened vigilance. Warriors stood in small groups, speaking with unusual intensity. "What's happening?" she asked Brightwater, sensing the elevated tension. The young woman frowned. "I don't know. Something has disturbed the peace." As they entered the camp proper, Akecheta appeared, his expression grave. He spoke rapidly to Waksfar woman, whose weathered face tightened at his words. "Soldiers," Brightwater translated for Margaret's benefit. "A cavalry patrol passed near our hunting grounds to the south. They questioned one of our hunting parties about recent attacks on settlers." Margaret's stomach clenched with apprehension. "What attacks?" "3 homesteads burned in the past week," Akecheta explained, switching to English. "Families killed in ways meant to suggest Indian raiders." The implications were immediately clear. The same pattern that had claimed Margaret's family was repeating. Violence committed by whites disguised as Crow, designed to provoke military action against the tribe. "Clayton Mercer," Margaret said, the name bitter on her tongue. Akecheta nodded grimly. "Almost certainly. He grows bolder, knowing the army already suspects our people for the Whispering Grass massacre." Medicine Caller emerged from the council lodge, beckoning his son with urgent gestures. Akecheta departed quickly, leaving Margaret with the gathering women and a growing sense of foreboding. "Come," Waksfar woman said, guiding Margaret toward their lodge. "Council meets now. No place for women until called." Inside the tipi, Margaret helped sort and hang the day's gathered plants, though her mind remained fixed on the ominous development. If Mercer's false flag attacks continued, how long before the army launched punitive expeditions against the Crow? And what would happen to her if soldiers discovered an elderly white woman living among those they considered hostile Indians? Her fears amplified as night descended, and Akecheta still had not returned from the council meeting. Finally, well after midnight, the tipi flap opened to admit him. His face in the dying firelight revealed both exhaustion and concern. "The council debates what must be done," he explained, accepting the cup of tea Waksfar woman offered. "Some, led by 2 dogs, argue we should break camp immediately and scatter to the winter grounds early. Others believe this would only confirm army suspicions of our guilt." "What did your father decide?" Margaret asked. "No decision yet. He has called for a vision quest to seek guidance." Akecheta's expression softened slightly as he regarded Margaret. "He asked about you specifically, whether you would be willing to speak with the cavalry commander if necessary." The request startled her. "To tell what I witnessed at Whispering Grass?" Akecheta nodded. "Your testimony might convince some officers that Mercer's attacks are being falsely attributed to our people." "Of course I would speak," Margaret affirmed, without hesitation. "But would they believe an old woman's account over that of respectable businessmen like Mercer?" "Some might not," Akecheta acknowledged. "But Captain Hollister, who commands the nearest fort, is known for his fairness. If we could arrange a meeting under safe conditions." The possibility hung in the air between them. Margaret potentially serving as bridge between worlds. Her unique position as both massacre survivor and Crow adoptee becoming an unexpected asset rather than liability. The next morning brought another significant development. As Margaret assisted Redwing with medicine preparation as planned, a commotion arose at the camp's eastern perimeter. Stepping outside the medicine woman's lodge, they saw riders approaching. Not soldiers, but a mixed group of men, some white, some clearly native. "Shoshone," Redwing identified, her expression cautious. "With white traders. The visitors, 3 white men and 4 Shoshone guides, were met at the camp's edge by Akecheta and several warriors. After a brief exchange, they were escorted to the council lodge where Medicine Caller awaited them. Throughout the day, speculation rippled through the camp about the visitors' purpose. Margaret continued her work with Redwing, learning to prepare a poultice for deep wounds using unfamiliar mountain herbs combined with a pine resin base. The activity kept her hands busy while her mind cycled through possibilities and implications of this new development. By evening, answers emerged. Akecheta came to Walksfar Woman's lodge, where Margaret now sat enjoying a simple meal of buffalo stew and wild onions. "The traders bring news and a proposal," he explained, accepting a bowl from his grandmother. "They confirm our suspicions. Clayton Mercer and his associates are behind the recent attacks, building support for military action against any Crow bands found outside reservation boundaries." "Why would traders share this information?" Margaret asked. "Most I've encountered have little love for Indians. These are independent traders, not company men," Akecheta clarified. "Their livelihood depends on peaceful relations with multiple tribes. War is bad for their business. And their proposal? They offer to carry a message to Captain Hollister at Fort Ellis, arranging a meeting between him and our representatives, including you." Akecheta studied her reaction carefully. "It would be dangerous. Mercer has informants at the fort." Margaret considered the risk against the potential benefit. "If my testimony could help prevent the army from attacking your people based on false accusations, the danger is justified." Akecheta nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her willingness. "The council has not yet decided whether to accept the trader's offer. Some, like Two Dogs, believe it's a trap. And your father, he weighs all possibilities, but he asked me to determine if you would go if the council approves." Margaret's gaze drifted to the fire, its dancing flames hypnotic as she contemplated this unexpected turn. 2 months ago, she had been a helpless survivor dependent on Akecheta's protection. Now she was being asked to potentially serve as witness and advocate for the people who had sheltered her. "I would go," she affirmed, meeting his eyes. "These past weeks, your people have shown me kindness I never expected to find again after losing my family. If my voice can help protect them, how could I refuse?" Walksfar Woman, who had listened silently to their exchange, spoke now in Crow, a lengthy statement delivered with dignified emphasis. "My grandmother says you have earned your name," Akecheta translated. "Survives the storm is not just about living through the attack that took your family. It is about finding strength to face new storms that approach." The elderly Crow woman then did something unprecedented. She reached across the space between them and took Margaret's hand in her own. The gesture, simple yet profound, transcended language and cultural barriers. "Sister," Walksfar Woman said in English, the word clearly practiced beforehand for this moment. Margaret felt tears rise, unbidden. "Sister," she echoed, gently squeezing the weathered brown hand that held hers. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. The fragile connection that had been building through shared healing work and language exchange crystallized into something more defined. A bond of mutual respect and growing affection between 2 elderly women who had begun as strangers from hostile worlds. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for sleep, she found herself studying the few possessions that connected her to her former life. The family Bible, with its record of births and deaths, the wooden medicine box her husband had carved for her 40 years earlier, the small daguerreotype of her lost family. These items remained precious links to her past, yet they no longer represented her only identity. Over the weeks among the Epsaluk, she had begun to develop new connections, new purpose, new understanding. She was still Margaret Blackwood, widow and bereaved grandmother from Ohio, but she was also becoming Survives the Storm, respected, elder and medicine woman of the Crow. This dual identity might prove crucial in the days ahead if she were indeed to stand between the worlds as witness to both tragedy and truth. The thought was daunting, yet strangely fitting, as though her life's unexpected final chapter had been preparing her precisely for this moment of bridging seemingly unbridgeable divides. Outside, the night deepened around the Absolute Summer camp. Somewhere in the darkness, council members still debated the traders' proposal and the approaching storm of potential conflict. Within Walk's Far Woman's lodge, two elderly healers slept peacefully, each drawing strength from the other's presence as they rested for whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. Dawn broke over the Absolute Summer camp with unusual tension, hanging in the air. The council had deliberated through the night, their discussion occasionally rising to heated exchanges that carried across the otherwise silent encampment. By first light, a decision had been reached, one that would irrevocably alter Margaret's place among these people and set in motion events whose consequences none could fully predict. Medicine. Caller himself came to Walk's Far Woman's lodge as Margaret helped prepare the morning meal. The elder's face was grave, etched with the weight of leadership in dangerous times. He spoke directly to Margaret in his limited English, dispensing with the usual protocol of addressing her through his son or granddaughter. "Council has decided," he announced without preamble. "We sent a message to Fort Ellis. Ask for a meeting with Captain Hollister. You will speak your truth about Whispering Grass." Margaret met his steady gaze with equal directness. "I understand." "When do we go?" "Not we," Medicine Caller corrected. "Too dangerous for many. Only you, Akacheta, and 2 warriors. Traders leave today with a message. If the captain agrees, the meeting happens at neutral ground in 5 days. The plan's simplicity belied its enormous risk. Margaret would essentially be placing herself back in army custody, relying on the integrity of a cavalry officer she'd never met to hear her testimony fairly, rather than simply dismissing her as delusional or compromised by her time among the Crow. Some in council still object," Medicine Caller continued, his weathered face revealing concern beneath his stoic demeanor. "Two Dog says you cannot be trusted, that you will betray us to save yourself." "I would never betray those who saved." "And me," Margaret replied firmly. "My word may not mean much to Two Dogs, but I give it nonetheless." Medicine Caller studied her for a long moment before nodding once. "I believe you. My son believes you. It is enough." After the elder departed, Walk's Far Woman placed a gnarled hand on Margaret's shoulder, speaking in a mixture of Crow and the English words she had been steadily acquiring. "Dangerous path," she said, her dark eyes reflecting genuine concern. "Need strong medicine for my journey." The elderly healer immediately set to work, instructing Margaret to gather specific items from their medicine stores. Together, they prepared a small leather pouch containing protective herbs, a healing salve for wounds, and medicines to maintain strength on the difficult journey ahead. Throughout the day, preparations continued for both the traders' departure and the potential meeting to follow. Akacheta selected the 2 warriors who would accompany them. His cousin Calls the Thunder, a formidable fighter in his prime, and an older, experienced scout named Many Coos, whose knowledge of territory between tribal lands and the fort would prove invaluable. As Margaret helped Walk's Far Woman sort medicinal plants outside their lodge, she noticed Little Fox approaching hesitantly, her young face serious. The girl had become a frequent visitor over recent weeks, fascinated by the healing work and increasingly attached to the elderly white woman she'd initially feared. "Are you leaving us?" Little Fox asked directly, having acquired enough English through their interactions to make herself understood. "Only for a short time," Margaret assured her, setting aside the yarrow she'd been bundling. "I must speak with the soldiers about what happened to my family." Little Fox frowned, processing this information. "Soldiers are dangerous. They killed my uncle last winter." The simple statement, delivered with a child's blunt honesty, crystallized the complexity of Margaret's position. To the army, she was a white woman, presumably rescued from hostile Indians. To Little Fox and many others in the camp, soldiers represented an existential threat to their people and way of life. Some soldiers do bad things, Margaret acknowledged, but some try to be fair. I must find those who will listen to the truth. Little Fox considered this, then reached into her small medicine pouch, a child's version of what all Apsaaluk carried. From it, she extracted a tiny carved figure of a meadowlark, polished smooth by handling. "Take the protector bird," she said, pressing it into Margaret's palm. "Grandfather carved it for me when my mother died. Brings good dreams when afraid." The unexpected gift, clearly one of the child's most precious possessions, touched Margaret deeply. "I will keep it safe and return it to you when I come back," she promised. Little Fox shook her head firmly. "Keep always. Remember, Little Fox, if soldiers don't let you come home." The possibility that hung unspoken between them, that Margaret might be prevented from returning to the Apsaaluka, hadn't been directly addressed by the adults planning the mission. Yet this child had identified the risk with unflinching clarity. By midday, the traders departed with Medicine Caller's formal message for Captain Hollister, leaving the camp to continue preparations for the potential meeting. Akacheta sought out Margaret as she worked with Redwing, learning to prepare a particularly potent pain remedy from mountain herbs. "We must prepare you," he explained, his expression serious. "If this meeting occurs, the army will expect certain things." "What things?" Margaret asked, wiping medicinal residue from her hands. "They will expect you to act like a woman rescued from captivity," he said carefully. "To show relief at returning to white society, perhaps fear or revulsion toward us." The suggestion struck Margaret as absurd, given the care she'd received among the Apsaaluk, but she understood the political necessity. "You want me to pretend I've been held against my will?" "Not exactly," Akacheta clarified, "but we cannot let them know how fully you've been accepted here. It would raise too many questions about why you weren't immediately brought to the fort. Upon your rescue." The practicality of his concern was undeniable. Any suggestion that a U.S. Army scout had willingly brought a white massacre survivor to live among the Crow rather than returning her to proper authorities would confirm the worst suspicions about Akacheta's divided loyalties. "I understand," Margaret assured him. "I know how to navigate such expectations. I spent decades as a woman healer in a world that preferred male doctors. Appearing to defer while actually directing conversations was a necessary skill." Akacheta's expression relaxed slightly at her understanding. "We must also consider your appearance. The buckskin dress, the hair styled in our way. These would raise questions." Margaret glanced down at the crow clothing she had grown comfortable wearing. "My original dress was badly damaged. What would you suggest?" The traders left suitable clothing. "It isn't exactly what white women typically wear, but it will look more appropriate than Apsaaluki garments." Redwing, who had been listening to their exchange while continuing her medicine work, spoke up in her limited English. "She needs white woman's hair also. I will help fix it before the journey." Thus began Margaret's reverse transformation, undoing the adaptations she'd made to Crow life in preparation for temporary re-entry into the white world. The trader's clothing consisted of a simple calico dress and shawl, rough but serviceable. Redwing and Brightwater helped her rearrange her silver hair from the Crow style back to a simple bun, more typical of elderly white women. Studying her reflection in a polished metal mirror, Margaret barely recognized herself. After weeks in Apsaaluki dress with her hair in traditional braids, the woman who gazed back at her seemed like a stranger, a ghost from her past life emerging to reclaim her. "You look like when Akacheta first brought you," Brightwater observed. "But Different too, stronger. The assessment was accurate. Though outwardly restored to her previous appearance, Margaret was fundamentally changed by her time among the Crow. She stood straighter, her movements more assured, her gaze clearer. The constant pain that had plagued her joints had diminished. Significantly under Walk's Far woman's care, and regular physical activity had restored strength she'd thought permanently lost to age. As evening approached, Medicine Caller summoned Margaret to the council lodge. There, in the presence of the tribal elders, he presented her with an unexpected gift, a necklace of polished elk teeth and blue trade beads. "This marks you as a friend of Apsayaluka," he explained as Brightwater translated the more complex concepts. "Not to wear when meeting soldiers, but to carry with you. It shows you speak with the voice of our people when you tell your story." The ceremonial recognition moved Margaret deeply, from reluctant refugee to acknowledged representative. Her journey among these people had transformed more than just her physical health. "I am honored by your trust," she responded, choosing her words carefully. "I will speak only the truth about what I witnessed and about the kindness I have received among your people." Two dogs, who had opposed her presence from the beginning, spoke harshly from his place in the council circle. Though Margaret's Crow vocabulary had expanded considerably, his rapid speech exceeded her comprehension. The hostile tone, however, required no translation. Brightwater leaned close to explain. "He says you will betray us when faced with your own kind, that your words now mean nothing once you are among whites again." Margaret addressed the skeptical warrior directly, speaking in the Crow language she had labored to learn. "I have lost my family. The Apsaluki became my new family. I will not forget this gift." Her imperfect but sincere use of their language visibly impacted several council members. Even Two Dogs seemed momentarily taken aback, though his expression quickly hardened once more. Medicine Caller ended the confrontation with a raised hand. "The decision is made," he stated with finality. "Survives. The storm will speak for us. We must trust the path the spirits have shown." That night, as Margaret prepared for sleep in Walk's Far woman's lodge, Akacheta visited once more. His expression was troubled as he sat beside the small fire. "News from our scouts," he explained without preamble. "Another homestead was attacked. Yesterday, 30 miles east of here. 6 settlers were killed, including 2 children. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the horror of more innocent lives lost in Mercer's cynical scheme. "The same pattern," Ekacheta nodded grimly. "The bodies were mutilated in ways meant to suggest Crow raiders, arrows left behind with our distinctive markings." "He's escalating," Margaret observed, cold dread settling in her stomach. "Building towards something larger." "Yes, these smaller attacks are merely preparation, creating a narrative of Crow hostility that justifies a military response." Akacheta's voice carried the weight of terrible certainty. "The army has requested reinforcements from Fort Laramie. They will arrive within 2 weeks. The implications were clear. If Margaret's testimony failed to convince Captain Hollister of Mercer's deception, the combined cavalry forces would likely launch punitive expeditions against any Crow bands found outside reservation boundaries, including the families gathered in this summer camp. "How soon can we meet with Captain Hollister?" she asked, practical despite her concern. "If he agrees to the meeting 4 days from now, the traders know to emphasize the urgency." Margaret nodded, mentally preparing herself for the challenge ahead. "And if he refuses," Akacheta's expression darkened, "then we must find another way to expose Mercer before the reinforcements arrive." Sleep came fitfully that night. Margaret's dreams haunted by images of burning wagons and dead families, sometimes her own loved ones at Whispering Grass, sometimes nameless settlers from the recent attacks, sometimes the very Apsaluk, people who had taken her in. She awoke before dawn, her heart racing with the conviction that time was running dangerously short. The next 3 days passed in tense anticipation. Normal camp activities continued: hunting, medicine gathering, preparation for the approaching autumn, but an undercurrent of anxiety permeated everything. Warriors patrolled the valley's perimeter with increased vigilance. Women packed essential items in preparation for possible quick departure. Children were kept closer to camp than usual, their play subdued by the adults' obvious concern. Margaret divided her time between assisting Walk's Far Woman with medicine preparation and practicing what she would say to Captain Hollister if given the opportunity. Brightwater helped her refine her testimony, suggesting ways to present evidence that white military men might find credible. "Speak of specific details," the young woman advised, "things only a true witness would know, and emphasize that you are a respectable widow, a grandmother, not someone given to wild tales." On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a scout galloped into camp with news. Captain Hollister had agreed to the meeting. It would take place the following day at Buffalo Crossing, a trading post operated by a retired army sergeant, known for fair dealings with both settlers and tribes. The captain agrees to bring only 4 soldiers, Akecheta reported after conferring with Medicine Caller. "We will bring the same number. You, me, Call the Thunder, and many coups." "Equal numbers suggest he's approaching this in good faith," Margaret observed. "Perhaps," Akecheta acknowledged cautiously. "Or he may have another motivation. The traders report he's under pressure from territorial officials who have business interests with Mercer." That evening, as preparations for the journey were completed, Margaret sought a private moment with Walk's Far Woman. The elderly healer had become more than just her host and teacher over the past weeks. She had become a friend, a counterpart, a sister in the twilight of life. "I may not return," Margaret said simply in the Crow language she had worked so hard to learn. "If the soldiers decide to hold me at the fort." Walk's Far Woman's weathered face revealed understanding beyond words. From a medicine pouch at her waist, she withdrew a small stone pendant, polished obsidian, suspended on a leather cord. "Black mirror stone," she explained, placing it around Margaret's neck. "Shows truth to those ready to see. Wear underclothing when meeting White Chief." The weight of the stone against Margaret's skin felt somehow reassuring, a physical connection to the woman who had helped heal not just her body, but her spirit in the aftermath of devastating loss. "If I don't return," Margaret continued, "my medicine box should be yours. The remedies, the knowledge, they should continue to serve the people." Walk's Far Woman grasped Margaret's hands on her own. "You return," she stated with calm certainty. "Path not finished yet." Before dawn the next morning, Margaret prepared for departure. She dressed in the trader's calico dress and arranged her hair in a simple style appropriate for an elderly white woman. Beneath these outer trappings of her former identity, however, she carried symbols of her adopted community: Little Fox's meadowlark carving tucked into a hidden pocket, Walk's Far Woman's obsidian pendant beneath her collar, Medicine Caller's ceremonial necklace wrapped carefully in soft leather and placed in her small travel bundle. Akecheta appeared at first light, similarly transformed. Gone was any visible trace of his Apsaluk heritage. He wore his scout uniform with military precision, his hair tied back severely, his bearing that of a U.S. Army employee rather than a Crow warrior. "Ready?" he asked simply. Margaret nodded, taking a final look around the lodge that had sheltered her through her extraordinary transformation from helpless survivor to adopted tribal member. As ready as possible. Outside, a small gathering had assembled to witness their departure. Medicine Caller offered a blessing in the Crow language, his deep voice carrying across the quiet dawn. Brightwater embraced Margaret briefly, whispering encouragement. Little Fox stood solemnly beside Swift Deer, her young face struggling to maintain composure. Most moving was Walk's Far Woman's farewell. A simple touch of her forehead to Margaret's, an intimate gesture between equals that required no words. To convey its depth of meaning, they departed as the sun created the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. Margaret rode the same mare that had carried her from Whispering Grass months earlier, now adorned with a proper saddle provided by the traders. Beside her rode Akecheta, transformed into Scout Thompson of the U.S. Army. Behind them followed the two warriors, Calls the Thunder and Many Coups, equally unreadable in their formal demeanor. As they created the ridge that would take them beyond sight of the summer camp, Margaret turned for a final look at the place that had become an unexpected sanctuary. The teepees stood in their perfect circle, smoke rising from morning fires, the river gleaming silver in the early light. It presented a vision of harmony and quiet dignity that contradicted every stereotype she'd ever encountered about wild Indians. Before her time among them, I will speak the truth, she promised silently, both to the people she was leaving behind and to the family she had lost at Whispering Grass. Whatever comes after, I will speak the truth. With that pledge renewed in her heart, Margaret turned her horse toward Buffalo Crossing and the confrontation that awaited. An elderly woman from Ohio, preparing to challenge powerful men with nothing but her witness and the strength she had found among those she'd once been taught to fear. The journey to Buffalo Crossing would take most of the day, following game trails and streams through increasingly open country. As they rode, Margaret rehearsed her testimony mentally, organizing the details she had witnessed at Whispering Grass into the most compelling possible narrative. Akecheta occasionally offered suggestions, but mostly rode in silence, his thoughts turned inward as he prepared for his own difficult role in the coming encounter. By midday, they had left the mountains. Behind, descending into rolling grasslands where visibility extended for miles in all directions. The changed terrain brought both advantage and risk. They could see potential threats approaching, but were themselves exposed to observation. "We are being watched," Many Coup announced quietly in Crow, pointing toward a distant ridge where a mounted figure was briefly visible before disappearing. "Army Scout," Akecheta confirmed. "Captain Hollister is cautious. He sends eyes ahead to ensure we match the agreed numbers." Margaret understood the tactical logic, but felt a flicker of apprehension. If the meeting were truly approached in good faith, such surveillance might be unnecessary. The captain's caution could indicate skepticism about their intentions, or perhaps pressure from those who preferred the Crow to be confirmed as guilty rather than innocent of the attacks. As afternoon waned, Buffalo Crossing appeared on the horizon, a collection of crude log structures surrounding a central trading post. No settlement proper, it served as neutral ground where various interests intersected: military, tribal, commercial. The American flag flew above the main building, while smoke rose from a nearby camp of what appeared to be Bannock traders. "Remember," Akecheta murmured as they approached, "you are Margaret Blackwood, survivor of Whispering Grass, rescued recently from the wilderness. Your time with the Apsaluke was brief, and under my protection as a scout returning you to civilization." Margaret nodded slightly, settling into the role circumstances required. She straightened her spine, adjusted her expression to reflect appropriate weariness and relief at returning to white society, and prepared to navigate perhaps the most consequential performance of her long life. At the trading post's edge, they were met by 4 mounted soldiers in cavalry blue, led by a man whose bearing and insignia identified him as Captain James Hollister. In his 40s, with a weather-beaten face and attentive eyes, he studied their approaching party with professional assessment. "Scout Thompson," he acknowledged Akecheta with a nod. "I see you've brought the witness as promised." His gaze shifted to Margaret, evaluating her with undisguised skepticism. In that moment, she felt the full weight of her precarious position an elderly woman emerging from supposed captivity, preparing to challenge the accepted narrative about events that had shaped military policy toward the Crow people. What happened next would determine not just her fate, but potentially that of the entire Apsaluk community that had saved her life and restored her purpose after unimaginable loss. Captain Hollister dismounted with military precision, handing his reins to a subordinate before approaching Margaret. His weathered face revealed little as he studied the elderly woman before him. "Mrs. Blackwood," he inquired, his tone professional but not unkind. "I'm Captain James Hollister, Fort Ellis. I understand you have information about the Whispering Grass massacre." Margaret met his gaze steadily, reading the mixture of skepticism and curiosity in his eyes. "I do, Captain. I'm the only survivor of that terrible day." Hollister gestured toward the trading post's main building. "Let's speak inside. These matters require privacy." The interior of Buffalo Crossing's central structure served multiple purposes: trading post, makeshift courthouse, and occasional meeting place for negotiations between various parties in the territory. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Maps of the region covered one wall, while shelves of trade goods lined another. As everyone settled around the table, Margaret and Akacheta on one side, Captain Hollister and his lieutenant on the other, with their respective escorts positioned strategically around the room, the power dynamics became immediately apparent. This was not a meeting of equals, but a military inquiry into contested events. "I've reviewed what little information we have about the Whispering Grass incident," Hollister began, consulting a leather folder containing official documents. "Our understanding has been that a wagon train of settlers was attacked by Crow raiders on May 18th of this year. 16 wagons destroyed, 37 settlers killed." He looked up from his papers, studying Margaret with increased attention. "Yet Scout Thompson reports finding you alive nearly 2 months after the attack, having somehow survived alone in hostile territory. That's remarkable for a woman of your years, Mrs. Blackwood." The implied question was clear, doubt about the plausibility of her survival story. "I'm tougher than I look, Captain," Margaret replied simply. "Necessity makes survivors of unlikely people." Something in her dignified response seemed to register with Hollister. He nodded slightly before continuing. "Tell me what you witnessed, from the beginning." Margaret took a deep breath and began the account she had carefully prepared. How she had wandered away from the wagon train to gather medicinal herbs, the sudden eruption of gunfire, her horrified witnessing of the attack from a hidden position, and most importantly, the clear identities of the attackers. "They were white men, Captain," she stated firmly, "disguised with war paint and feathers, but white men nonetheless. I heard them speak to each other, saw their faces clearly when some removed their headgear after the killing was done." Hollister's lieutenant scoffed openly. "Convenient that you alone saw this, when all official reports indicate Crow involvement." "What? Official reports?" Margaret challenged. "From whom? There were no survivors besides myself." "We have sworn testimony," the lieutenant insisted, "from a man who escaped the massacre. Clayton Mercer, a respected businessman from Helena, was traveling with the wagon train when it was attacked. He provided a detailed description of the Crow raiders." "Clayton Mercer was never part of our wagon train," Margaret stated flatly. "I knew every soul in that company. We were 16 families from Ohio and Pennsylvania, led by my son, Thomas Blackwood. Mr. Mercer's name was never mentioned among us." This direct contradiction of the official narrative created a moment of tense silence. Captain Hollister's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "You're certain of this?" he asked. "Captain, I may be old, but my mind remains clear," Margaret responded. "I could name every member of that wagon train for you right now. Clayton Mercer was not among them." Hollister exchanged a glance with his lieutenant. Continue your account, Mrs. Blackwood. Margaret proceeded to describe the aftermath of the massacre, her night spent hiding, her discovery of the bodies including her son, daughter-in-law and grandchildren, and her eventual rescue by Akacheta. Scout. Thompson found me near collapse, she explained, careful to maintain the agreed-upon narrative. He provided water, food, and protection on the journey back to civilization. Yet you didn't arrive at Fort Ellis, Hollister observed. Why did the scout not bring you directly to military authorities? Here was the dangerous question they had anticipated. Akacheta answered smoothly, his voice carrying the neutral tone of a military scout rather than a Crow warrior. The lady was extremely frail, Captain. I judged her unable to withstand immediate travel to the fort. I sought a safe location where she could recover strength first. And this location was, Hollister pressed. A trapper's cabin I know of, Akacheta replied without hesitation. Isolated but defensible, I provided supplies and checked on her. Progress regularly while continuing my scouting duties. The prepared explanation was plausible, though Margaret noted the captain's slight frown of skepticism. Before he could pursue this line of questioning further, she redirected the conversation. Captain Hollister, while recovering from my ordeal, I learned something disturbing, she said. The massacre at Whispering Grass was not an isolated incident. Other settlers have been attacked in similar fashion, with the same deception orchestrated to blame the Crow. Hollister's expression shifted subtly. You're referring to the recent homestead attacks east of here? Yes, the pattern is identical. White men disguised as Crow raiders, leaving false evidence behind. The lieutenant interrupted sharply. This is preposterous. Are we to believe that respectable businessmen are masquerading as Indians to murder innocent settlers? What possible motive could exist? Land, Lieutenant, Margaret answered simply. Specifically, access to Crow hunting territories rumored to contain valuable mineral deposits. As long as the Apsailuk remain free to use their traditional grounds, those deposits cannot be exploited. But if the army were to forcibly confine all Crow to the reservation as punishment for alleged raids, she let the implication hang in the air. Hollister sat back, his expression troubled as he absorbed the logic of her analysis. These are serious accusations, Mrs. Blackwood. Do you have any evidence beyond your eyewitness account? I can identify Clayton Mercer if presented with him, Margaret offered, and I can tell you details about the massacre that only someone who was truly present would know. Details that contradict Mr. Mercer's testimony. Hollister considered this, then turned to Akacheta. What do your people say about these attacks, Thompson? Are they being falsely blamed? It was a pivotal moment, an army officer directly asking a native scout to speak for his people rather than merely report observations. Akacheta met the captain's gaze steadily. The Apsailuk have maintained peace with white settlers according to treaty terms, he stated. These attacks do not serve our interests. They violate our principles. But proving our innocence has been impossible without witnesses like Mrs. Blackwood. For several moments, Hollister sat in thoughtful silence, weighing the competing narratives. Finally, he addressed his lieutenant. Bring me Mercer's sworn statement. The officer retrieved a document from the leather folder. Hollister reviewed it briefly before looking up at Margaret. Mr. Mercer claims the attack occurred at dusk, as the wagon train was making camp for the evening. He describes over 30 Crow warriors descending from the eastern ridgeline, led by a warrior with a distinctive eagle feather headdress. Margaret shook her head firmly. The attack came at midday, Captain. We were still traveling, not making our camp. My son was walking beside the lead wagon, discussing the route with Mr. Peterson, our guide, and the attackers came from the north, not the east, using the sun's position to blind the defenders. These specific contradictions clearly registered with Hollister. He reviewed the document again, his frown deepening. Mercer also claims the Indians took significant time to plunder the wagons before setting them afire, he continued. False again. Margaret countered. They killed quickly and efficiently, took only money and valuables that could be easily carried, then burned the wagons immediately to destroy evidence. The entire attack lasted perhaps 20 minutes, not the extended raid Mr. Mercer describes. With each contradiction, Hollister's expression grew more troubled. He turned to his lieutenant. These discrepancies are significant. Either Mrs. Blackwood is fabricating her account, or Mercer was never there as he claimed. She's been living among savages for months, the lieutenant argued dismissively. How can we trust her recollection over that of a respected businessman? Margaret's spine stiffened at the casual slur, but she maintained her composure. Test my memory then, Captain. Ask me details about the wagon train that only a true member would know. The names of the families, the number and types of livestock we traveled, with the contents of the wagons. Over the next hour, Hollister did exactly that, questioning Margaret extensively about every aspect of the wagon train's composition and journey. Her answers revealed an intimate knowledge that could only come from actual experience, down to specific details about food supplies, personal possessions, and the internal politics of the traveling party. Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Collins had a terrible argument 3 days before the massacre, she recalled at one point. Over 20 pounds of sugar that had gone missing from the communal supplies. It nearly divided the wagon train until my son negotiated a compromise. Such specific, mundane details clearly impressed Hollister. As the questioning concluded, he sat back with the air of a man reaching a difficult decision. I find your testimony compelling, Mrs. Blackwood, he acknowledged. Compelling enough to warrant further investigation of Mr. Mercer's activities and associations. Hope flickered in Margaret's heart, but she recognized that the captain's words fell short of full acceptance. Will you suspend military action against the Crow while you investigate? She pressed. Hollister hesitated. I can delay the reinforcements from Fort Laramie by citing need for further intelligence gathering. That will buy perhaps 2 weeks. Not enough time, Acacheta interjected, the concern in his voice momentarily revealing his personal stake in the matter. Mercer is well connected. Any investigation through official channels will be obstructed. What would you suggest then? Scout? Hollister asked, a new note of respect in his address. A trap, Acacheta proposed, using Mrs. Blackwood's survival as bait. Margaret turned to him in surprise, but quickly grasped his strategy. You want to flush Mercer out by revealing my existence? Acacheta nodded. If he learns there's a witness who can identify him and his men, he'll be forced to act, either to eliminate you or flee the territory. And you propose to use this elderly woman as bait for murderers? The lieutenant objected, though whether from concern for Margaret or opposition to the plan itself wasn't clear. No, Hollister corrected thoughtfully, not as defenseless bait, as the centerpiece of a carefully orchestrated operation. He studied Margaret with new appreciation. If you're willing, Mrs. Blackwood. Margaret didn't hesitate. I've come this far, Captain. I won't stop now. The plan took shape quickly. Margaret would be publicly announced as a survivor of Whispering Grass, rescued and now recovering at Fort Ellis. Her statement contradicting Mercer's account would be mentioned, but with details withheld. The implied threat to his deception would force his hand. He'll either send men to silence you or attempt to discredit you before you can testify formally, Hollister predicted. Either way, he'll expose himself. And my people, Acacheta asked, what assurance do they have that military action won't proceed against them while this plays out? Hollister considered this, then made a decision that surprised everyone present. You have my word as an officer that no action will be taken against any Crow band, absent new evidence of their involvement in the attacks. And I'll put that in writing for your counsel. The commitment, unprecedented from a cavalry officer to a tribal representative, reflected how thoroughly Margaret's testimony had shifted his understanding of the situation. 2 days later, Margaret sat in a small but comfortable room at Fort Ellis, officially under protective custody, but in reality serving as the central figure in Hollister's trap. Word of her survival and contradictory testimony had been strategically leaked through various channels likely to reach Mercer. The response came faster than anyone anticipated, not through assassins or hired guns, but through Mercer himself, who arrived at the fort demanding to confront this confused old woman whose delusions threatened to undermine territorial security. Captain Hollister arranged the meeting in his office, with Margaret seated calmly beside his desk. When Clayton Mercer strode in, a well-dressed man in his 40s with cold eyes and an arrogant bearing, she studied him with careful attention. "This is the supposed witness?" Mercer scoffed. "A senile old woman?" Before Hollister could respond, Margaret spoke directly to Mercer. "We haven't been introduced, sir, yet you claim to have travelled with my family's wagon train for weeks. Curious that I have no recollection of your presence." Mercer's expression hardened. "Trauma affects memory, madam. The savage attack you witnessed clearly. The wagon directly behind ours belonged to the Miller family," Margaret interrupted. "Their eldest daughter, Mary, was expecting her first child. What was her husband's name?" The question, impossible for Mercer to answer but trivial for anyone who had actually travelled with the wagon train, created a momentary silence. "I didn't socialize with," Mercer began. "Samuel," Margaret supplied. "Samuel Jenkins, a blacksmith. From Dayton." She turned to Hollister. "This man was never part of our company, Captain. He's a liar and likely orchestrated the murder of my family." What happened next unfolded with startling speed. Mercer, recognizing the trap closing around him, made a desperate move toward the door. Hollister's guards intercepted him, but in the struggle he drew a concealed derringer. "She's lying," he shouted, swinging the small pistol toward Margaret. "The Indians have corrupted her mind." A single shot rang out, not from Mercer's weapon, but from the doorway where Akacheta stood, his army-issued revolver smoking. Mercer collapsed, wounded in the shoulder, the derringer clattering harmlessly to the floor. "Your actions condemn you more effectively than any testimony could," Hollister observed coldly, as his men secured the prisoner. In the days that followed, the conspiracy unraveled rapidly. Facing serious charges and abandoned by his once powerful allies, Mercer bargained for leniency by revealing his accomplices and the full scope of their plan. Documents seized from his Helena office confirmed Margaret's suspicions: maps of mineral deposits on Crow hunting grounds, falsified claims, ready to be filed once the army cleared the hostile Indians from the territory. Captain Hollister kept his word. Not only did he cancel the military operations planned against the Crow, but he formally acknowledged in his report to territorial authorities that the tribe had been falsely blamed for attacks committed by white criminals. 1 week after the confrontation with Mercer, Margaret stood outside Fort Ellis beside a loaded wagon, preparing for yet another journey. Akacheta, once again in his scout uniform, secured the final provisions. "The captain has arranged for army protection until you reach Helena," he explained. "From there, the stage line can take you to wherever you wish to go. Your sister-in-law, in St. Louis, has been notified of your survival." Margaret nodded, but her eyes drifted toward the distant mountains where the Apsaluk summer camp lay hidden. "I've been considering my destination carefully. Most survivors would eagerly return to familiar surroundings after such an ordeal," Akacheta observed. "Most survivors haven't found new purpose in unexpected places," Margaret replied. She turned to face him directly. "I'm an old woman, Akacheta. The years ahead of me are few. Should I spend them among strangers in St. Louis, or continue the healing work that gives my life meaning?" Understanding dawned in his expression. "You wish to return to the Apsaluk?" "If the council permits it," Margaret confirmed. Not as a refugee this time, but as survives the storm, medicine woman, and adopted sister to Walk's Far woman. Akacheta's normally stoic demeanor softened. My grandmother would welcome this, as would Little Fox, who asks daily when you will return. And Medicine Caller? The council? Your actions have protected our people from military aggression. Even Two Dogs acknowledges this debt. A hint of a smile touched his lips, though he would still watch you carefully around the warrior's horses. The reference to her disastrous attempt to help with the horsekeeping duties, a misadventure that had become something of a camp legend, broke the solemnity of the moment. Margaret laughed, the sound surprising even herself. Then let us adjust our journey accordingly, she decided. I have testimony to provide in Helena for the territorial court, but afterward I would return to the mountains. As they travelled, away from Fort Ellis, Margaret felt the weight of the past gradually lifting. The grief for her lost family would never disappear entirely, but it had transformed into something bearable, integrated into a new identity forged in the most unlikely circumstances. 3 weeks later, she stood once again on the ridge overlooking the Absolute summer camp. Though the season had advanced toward autumn, the fundamental scene remained the same. Tipis arranged in their perfect circle, the river flowing silver through the valley, daily life continuing in its harmonious rhythm. As they descended toward the camp, figures emerged to meet them. Walk's Far woman in the lead, supported by her walking stick but moving with determination. Little Fox running ahead, her face alight with excitement. Medicine Caller and the council elders maintaining dignified pace, but clearly awaiting their arrival. Welcome home, survives the storm, Walk's Far. Woman greeted her in English, the carefully practiced phrase carrying all the warmth of genuine feeling. Margaret dismounted, feeling the rightness of this return. In the deepest part of her being, I have returned to my sisters and brothers, she responded in careful crow, if they will let me stay. Medicine Caller stepped forward, his weathered face solemn as he addressed the gathered community. Survives. The storm spoke truth when truth was dangerous. She protected Apsaluki when her own people would not listen. The council recognizes her as a friend and healer among us for as long as she wishes to remain. Little Fox could contain herself no longer. She rushed forward to embrace Margaret, chattering excitedly in mixed English and Crow. You brought my meadowlark back. Did it protect you from bad spirits? It did, Margaret assured her, returning the carved figure to its original owner. But I find I no longer need such protection. I am home now. As the sun set over the valley, Margaret sat beside Walk's Far woman's lodge fire, helping sort the day's gathered medicines. Their hands moved in practiced coordination, needing few words to communicate which plants belonged in which preparations. Winter comes soon, Walk's Far woman observed, glancing at the mountains where early snow already dusted the highest peaks. Much to teach before dark months. I am ready to learn, Margaret replied, and to share what I know. The elderly Crow woman nodded with satisfaction. Good balance. You bring new medicine, we give old wisdom, both needed for healing. In this simple exchange lay the essence of Margaret's unexpected final chapter. Not mere survival, but transformation. Not just refuge, but renewed purpose. The massacre at Whispering Grass had taken everything she valued, yet through the courage and compassion of an unlikely guardian, she had found a new world where her remaining years could serve a meaningful role. As stars appeared above the mountains, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun in blood and loss had carried her through grief and danger to this moment of belonging. Whatever winters remained in her life would be spent in the company of those who valued both her knowledge and her spirit, a fate she could never have imagined, yet now embraced with gratitude. Up next, You've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.